Right. Well, I have the pleasure of following a former CSIS agent outing CSIS, and I stand between you and lunch. So it's a great position to be in while I'm waiting for my presentation to come up. I'll just get started while you're pulling up the presentation to save time. I want to just begin by thanking. I move my hands around a lot, so this is going to be flying all over the place. Uh, I want to begin by thanking the organizers, Dr. Reem especially, for one organizing this and giving me the opportunity to come here. It's really an honor. I mean, I'm literally standing in the presence of people that have been my teachers throughout my academic journey. So it really is an honor to be here. And I'm very grateful to be with my co-panelists that are excellent co-panelists and speaking in front of such a distinguished audience. So I want to begin by thanking you all for being here and for giving me the opportunity. So I just wanted to kind of begin with a little confession. I was snuck into this program like literally about, I think, 2 days ago. I know some people have been prepared. I guess I came to know that some people that are up here have literally been preparing their papers for years. I had the luxury of 2 days. But nonetheless, I'm grateful to be here. So I'll just be talking about a book project that I recently completed. So, I think my presentation is going to come off as a bit of a plug for this project. It kind of is that, but I wanted to put it out there that I was asked to plug this. So that's why I'm up here talking about this project. That, by the way, is the cover of the book, The Rise of Global Islamophobia and the War on Terror. It's a co-edited project between myself and my co-editor, Farid Hafiz. All right, so let's move along. Oh, I think I need a clip. Oh, are you doing it? Okay, all right. I'll just give you like a little gunpoint, not to frighten you or anything. All right. So in this presentation, I'm just gonna kind of outline sort of the origins of this project, where it came from, why I want to engage with it. Then kind of getting into sort of the themes of the panel itself of racialization in theory and practice. I'll be talking about that through the notions of Islamophobia in theory and practice, and then some concluding thoughts, and hopefully we'll have time for some question and answers after that. So, all right, so the origins of the project. So in terms of my academic sort of trajectory, I typically, throughout my graduate studies and even afterwards, I really looked at this phenomenon of Islamophobia from a global North perspective. So most of my work was looking at the Canadian context, the US and Europe and places of the global North. That began to shift in about 2018 when I had the opportunity to visit Bangladesh, where I went to the Rohingya refugee camps. I'm sure those of you are aware of this. This genocide took place in August 2017. It created one of the largest mass migrations, at least the fastest growing refugee crisis in the world at the time, where 250,000 Rohingya, which are a Muslim ethnic minority group, migrated from forcefully migrated from Myanmar to Bangladesh. So I had the opportunity to visit the camps and hear firsthand accounts of the survivors of the genocide, and it really kind of inspired me to kind of examine what caused all this. A genocide doesn't happen overnight. It's something it's a process. It takes time and it kind of bubbles to the surface through this extreme violence. So I began to explore what exactly happened, and in my sort of exploration, I began to notice these sort of patterns, between institutional and interpersonal forms of racism throughout Myanmar's history against the Rohingya, and kind of the things that I've been working with over the years. And so it kind of really forced me to re-examine my understandings and the way I conceptualize Islamophobia. So the project itself is, as I mentioned earlier, an edited volume covering Islamophobia from the global North and global South. I believe up to date, it's the first volume that covers 6 of the 7 continents. So every continent except for Antarctica is covered in this volume in some way or fashion. We covered 14 country contexts. We tried to give equal representation, so they're between the global North and global South. So we talk about there's 7 chapters from the global North, 7 from the global South, or 7 country contexts covered in the global North, and 7 covered in the global South. We also we made a conscious effort to kind of cover spaces in nation states that don't typically get talked about when you discuss Islamophobia. So we included South Africa, the triple frontier region of South America, and other places that typically don't get talked about. In terms of the way the book is organized, we talked about categorizations of Islamophobia to kind of create a coherent narrative for the book. And so we kind of, the categorizations that we discuss are Islamophobia in settler societies, which include Canada, the US, and Australia. Islamophobia in formal imperial states, which include European nations that have a history of colonizing Muslim majority lands. So those are the UK, France, the Netherlands, and Austria. And we included as well formerly colonized nations from the global south. So these were South Africa and the Triple Frontier region of South America, and Islamophobia at a breaking point. So these were areas that had extreme manifestations of Islamophobia, which included China, India, and Myanmar. In terms of, can we just move on to the next one? So in terms of the way we kind of situate ourselves, in terms of the way we situate ourselves, there's different ways that Islamophobia is examined in the academic literature. It's been explored through prejudice studies, race and critical race studies, and post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. We kind of situated ourselves within that sort of critical race, academic literature, as well as post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. The reason being is because, we really wanted to kind of highlight how, and this is, I think, a common theme throughout the presentations today, that the war on terror is really kind of an imperial project. It's really has these continuities of colonialism that are embedded within them. And so we asked every one of our contributors to kind of look at, Islamophobia within those contexts, but kind of tying it to a sort of historical discussion around race and racism, and seeing if they can draw these links between imperialism and coloniality. And overwhelmingly, every single one of the states that we covered had that sort of connection between either colonialism or imperialism in some way or fashion. So when we look at, for example, at the Islamophobia in settler societies, settler societies, North America, Australia, and others, they have that sort of kind of history of, genocide of native populations, indigenous populations. And there's this kind of this project of myth making around those nations, creating this sort of history, this sort of national mythology or narrative around, the whiteness of the nation, and preserving sort of white supremacy and privilege within those spaces. And as Dr. Razak and I'm sure others have mentioned throughout the day, that's kind of part and parcel in terms of how Islamophobia is manifested institutionally and as well as interpersonally, right, through immigration laws in the past, as well as anti-terrorism laws in the current context, and then as well as you see in the protest movements and these sort of informal and formal organizations which target minority communities. If we can move to the next slide. In these nation states that fall in that sort of category of former imperial states, there's all of the nations that we looked at here, they have a history of colonizing Muslim majority lands. And when you look at their sort of their history of managing these colonies, there's a lot of this continuity in terms of how they manage the Muslim subjects within their nations. So if you look at France, for example, throughout their history, there was an adamant effort to stamp out any kind of religious symbols in the public sphere, specifically the hijab. Frantz Fanon talks about this quite a bit, where there's this conscious effort of destroying the cultural, any kind of cultural representations of Islam in the public sphere. And if you look at what's happening in France, for the last 20 years, this has been the case as well. If you look at the case of the Netherlands in the managing of the Indonesian colonies, right? There's this idea of this fear around pan-Islamism, right? This idea that Muslims can express any form of political agency. And more you see in spaces like Austria, the Netherlands, and in France, the notions of Muslim political agency have become criminalized under the pretext of countering political Islam. Now, what political Islam really entails is not really clearly defined at all. And as a result of that, any form of sort of criticisms of the state, any forms of public expression, any form of Islam, any forms of questioning or confronting the laws that are targeting Muslims are essentially deemed potential criminal acts. If we can move on to the next slide. If we look at those, if we look at other spaces from the global south, right? In China, traditionally the Uyghurs have been seen as, or have been constructed as a sort of threat to the cohesion of the state. But there's a reason for that, right? Ethnically, linguistically, religiously, they differ from the majority. And there's a reason behind that because, Xinjiang province, this is that's a colonial settler project. And so there is that sort of connection between that sort of this idea of imperialism that is related to what's happening in Xinjiang as well. Now, in the context of the war on terror, there's been a shift now when how the state talks about that region, and now they're not being constructed as a cultural threat, but more as a security threat. And in that sort of environment, anything and everything is justified, even internment camps and ethnic cleansing. If we can move on to the next slide. In the context of Myanmar as well, the tensions between the Rohingya and the Burmese Buddhist majority, the tensions kind of, the starting point of the tensions really begins way back in the colonial era, where the British, when they administered that colony, they created these divisions between those minority groups, and this kind of fuels a lot of the tension that's happening. That happened, in the post-colonial era during the time of the military coup, where extreme forms of institutional racism was targeted against the Rohingya, specifically making them stateless and confining them to ghettos and restricting access to education and social mobility. So to tie it all up and to connect it to the sort of the themes of our panel today, we can move on to the next slide. Ultimately, I think when you look at the sort of the theoretical ideas around the war on terror, at a theoretical level, the war on terror is a modern-day imperial project that has created a paradoxical thinking of war on terror logic. Now, in the volume itself, I talk about this idea of war on terror logic, and I kind of define it as the following. This paradoxical viewpoint imagines terrorism and other forms of political violence as existing exclusively through Muslim otherness, while simultaneously sanitizing blatant manifestations of them emanating from within the national space/subject as a requirement to police the dangerous Muslim. In other words, what's happening in the war on terror is that this idea or the notion of terrorism is kind of become an exclusive, like Muslims have a monopoly over this idea of terrorism. They're really seen as the only legitimate or threat of terrorism. And in order to police that threat, acts of extreme violence and state-sanctioned terrorism has essentially been justified to be able to police that. So it's a very kind of paradoxical and ironic way of looking at sort of this colonial logic that has come about. So the war on terror has pretty much created sort of that context for this thinking to come about and be justified. So in terms of getting back to sort of the ideas of racialization in theory and practice, at a theoretical level, the war on terror has sort of created or reimagined or repackaged this imperial project. And on a practical level, everything and anything from the violation of civil liberties, which we see in the North American and in settler societies in general, to genocide and ethnic cleansing, which we see in other spaces, is essentially justified under the pretext of national security, right? So in practice, everything and anything has become justified and free game to kind of perpetuate this sort of colonial logic that's happening through the war on terror. So again, like I said before, I don't want to go too long. I know it's been a long panel, so we'll end it there so we can open up for Q&A. Thank you.